To help find the exact part of this longer video that you're looking for, I've added some timestamps right down below in the description so you can find exactly what you're looking for in this video. There's also a link down there to the written transcript, which is available on my Medium account. Don't forget, thumbs up if you enjoyed. The recent ban and restricted announcement took Violent Outburst out of the modern metagame entirely and sent ripples through the upper tiers of the modern metagame. Temur Rhinos, once the powerhouse of the format, suddenly had one of its best cards and play lines removed from the deck entirely. At the same time, the recent release of Leyline of the Guild Pact made best friends with a Modern Horizons creature in Scion of Draco and was popping up in decks from Zoo all the way to Infect. Magic Online queues were overrun with these Leyline decks, and people trying to figure out if banning Outburst led to Rhinos finding a way to cascade on turn 2 now. With this weekend's Legacy European Tour Grand Open qualifier in Prague, it was the first large event after this big modern metagame shakeup. Now, although I normally talk about Pioneer and Standard, I was really interested in how Modern would look after these changes, so I couldn't really pass up the chance to dive into the numbers. I'm going to look at the metagame breakdown as a whole, also known as how many of each deck there were in the room, finding the most popular deck in the room based on those numbers, looking at the most successful decks based on win rate alone, not number of decks, and finally looking at how the new top presence decks matched up against one another with a full matchup matrix for each of those decks. Now, before I go through everything and get into the real meat and potatoes of the video, I do need to establish a full the ground rules about this analysis I performed. First off, I am working with the results that LMS has put in through the Melee GG platform page, which says that even though there were 563 registered players, the results only have 560 players listed. So my numbers are going to reflect the number of players with results and not the number of registered players. Melee also has 13 players with no submitted deck list in their system, which means I can account for their deck archetype. While they do count towards the total of 560 players in the room, their results have been listed as no list available or NA, so that they do not influence archetypes at all. Lastly, I've gone through and manually checked all of the deck lists to eliminate people that have named their decks silly things. Seriously, this is like the second time I've seen that Tenrak is a deck list for not list running the Rack or Davriel or Shrieking Affliction at all. Like, is this some sort of meme in the modern community that I'm unfamiliar with? Because it's teasing me. I want to see that deck in action. Regardless, I've condensed all the lists down to the respective archetypes, such as Rakdos Evoke and Rakdos Scam, being the same thing as long as they have the same core card package of Grief and Scam, while decks like Rakdos Waste Not will be using cards not found in the traditional list for its archetype. Alright, ground rules and menu are out of the way, so let's get to the appetizer of our course through the newly changed modern format, the overall picture of the modern metagame. This is going to look at every deck type that was in the room and how many copies of each of them there were. So, according to my breakdown, there were 93 different deck archetypes at the event in Prague, which is a massive number of decks to have at any sort of event. However, not every list had a ton of copies in the room. Breaking down the lists at Prague, 43 of those 93 decks only had one copy in the room, which means that 46.2% of the decks in the room were the only one of their kind. So if you ran into them, you're a lucky special opponent. Or if you lost, you're unlucky, I suppose. While having a lot of decks makes the format look healthy and wide open, it's important to remember that the number of decks is what matters when we're looking for consistent variations in a format regarding its deck diversity and well-being. There were several archetypes that fell into the category of more than one deck in the room, but not enough to make a big impact on the overall metagame share. All of these decks have less than 1% share of the metagame at Prague, but it includes some of the format favorites. Variations of Hammer Time, Stoneblade, Merfolk, Underworld Breach, Humans, and of course, my personal favorite 8-Rack, all fall into this area of the analysis. Some of this can be contributed to the fact that modern players will play whatever they want given the chance. Much like legacy players, everybody kind of has their own pet deck. Other factors could include the fact that some of these decks are just underrepresented at the current point in time. To really focus on which it could be, we do need to look at their win rates, which we will at some of these later on in the video. At the top of the metagame presence, there are 12 deck archetypes that had double-digit numbers at the event in Prague, which accounts for 12.9% of the decks in the room. Although that's less than the number of singleton decks, just take any of the top 3 presence decks here and look at them. They had more copies of that deck alone in the room than all of the singleton lists combined. These decks here will be the main focus for our later analysis when we look at the top decks in the room and their matchup matrices. As you can see, these are the expected suspects like Domain Zoo, Yawgmoth, Tron, Amulet Titan, Scam, and the more recently popular Esper Goryo's decks make up the majority of this section of decks. Rhinos and Murktide are still hanging onto their spot near these top of the decks, and if you go down to decks just under the double digits but still high enough to make up 1% or larger of the metagame share, we do see decks like Temur Mill, Boros Burn, and 4-color Control peeking their heads out. Now for the next course of our analysis, I have assigned a popularity tier to look at all these decks, which basically sees how far above the average number of decks in the room each archetype was. So anything in the S tier is something you can expect to see multiple copies of at any event you may play in the next few weeks, including your own local game store, while decks down in the C tier may still pop up, but not as frequently. We're mostly going to focus on the top 10 presence decks in the room, or well, top 11 for this breakdown, as we don't have a clean top 10 cutoff, as you may have seen with Scales, Coffers, and Domain Rhinos all sharing 3% of the metagame. Of all these decks, Domain Zoo was the one with a target on its back coming into the event, and for good reason. Besides being all over the online queues, the archetype had the most decks by far at Prague with 71 decks, accounting for 12.7% of the metagame share. That's just slightly over 1 in 8 decks in the room being this Domain Zoo deck. Despite the cries of how powerful it was though, the deck did not dominate the win rate at the event, coming out with a still good but not overpowering 51.8% win rate total. We'll look at what decks may have done well into the Zoo list a little bit later, but it's important to note that while Domain list did make the top 8 at the event, it was one of the few lists running the Grief Scam package that most of the other Domain lists did not run. Because of that, the top 8 list is not reflected in this category for the deck. Instead, it's its own archetype with the other Zoo lists running in the Grief Scan combo. Yawgmoth was the other boogeyman of the format that was expected to be at Prague in force, but it ended up performing more poorly than people may have expected. The second most copies in the room, but a 48.2% win rate, might not be one of the best results for the deck in recent tournaments, but it was far from the lowest win rate for the top presence decks, as that honor unfortunately went to modern mainstay Tron. Towers, power plants, and mines were not well received in Prague, as the deck's 7.9% metagame share ended up with a measly 41.4% win rate at the event. Tron, unlike Yawgmoth, did not have any copies in the top 8 to boot. Esper Goryo's was the other deck that was popular online just prior to the LMS event, tying for the 4th most popular deck in the room at a 6.1% metagame share, and putting up the 2nd highest win rate for top presence decks with a 52.3% win record. Who knew that an archetype that hadn't seen much play since Modern Horizon 2's release would pop up again thanks to Atraxa and some Surveillance? Tied with the Reanimator deck in metagame share was another classic modern archetype, Amulet Titan. It almost tied the newer list in win rate as well, clocking in at just 0.2% less with 52.1% win rate for the 3rd highest on this top presence list. Titan continues to be fast enough and large enough to just dominate the modern format. Rakdos Scam still hangs on to a top spot in modern players' hearts and deck boxes with a 5.9% metagame share and an above average performance with a 51.1% win rate. A single list managed to even make it all the way to the semifinals, losing to Amulet Titan. That version ran both Inti and Stalactite Stalker alongside the core Scam package. Although this isn't a stock standard addition to the list, I did include these decks in the general Scam archetype as they didn't deviate that far away from the main core of the deck. Temur became the favorite flavor of a lot of modern players' favorite deck, Murktide.
Although a lot of the lists were just Izzet decks splashing for pick your poison, some of these decks did opt for Questing Druid package and some extra sideboard cards. Regardless of its configuration though, it wasn't the best weekend for the Delving Dragon, with a 5.7% metagame share resulting in a sub 50% record with a 46.4% win rate. Creativity came back with larger numbers this weekend. The Archon-wielding 5-color deck did well for itself with a 51.1% win rate across a 4.3% metagame share. Turns out, putting a giant flying creature into play that taxes your opponent's board and resources ahead of schedule still works just fine, even if it isn't legendary. Of the remaining lists at a 3% metagame share, Domain Rhinos, which is the evolution of the former Temur version, which has also adapted the Leyline Scion package, actually put up the lowest win rate at 49.3%. While it's below the 50-50 mark, it's so darn close and just ever so slightly below that it's not a clear indication the deck is truly dead despite the Violent Outburst ban. Seeing Hardened scales do well enough to hit a 50.9% win rate isn't as surprising as seeing it be one of the top presence decks at the event to me. Although I wouldn't have pegged Mono Black Coffers to both be in the top presence decks and have the highest win rate out of the most popular decks. With a 53.2% win rate, Coffers snagged the top spot from the Esper Goryo's deck, making an argument for breakout deck of the event.
So for now, we've been able to establish what the most popular decks in Prague were, but now it's time to look at the most winning decks of the event. Now, just a reminder that this metric is looking at purely the archetype's win rate. So it doesn't matter if the deck played the entire event or how many copies of the deck were in the room. It's just the archetype's win rate, which is wins over matches played. So even ties don't really mean anything here for win rate. It actually kind of hurts it. While 3 decks are tied for the top win rate spot, the 1 copy of the Bloodbraid Rhinos deck stands out the most, as this was the deck that streamers such as Aspiring Spike were messing around with immediately after the Violent Outburst ban hit. You're looking to leverage split cards at 2 types to hit Delirium as quickly as possible so that Bloodbraid Marauder gains Cascade and hits a Crashing Footballs as early as turn 2. While inconsistent at best, the deck does still offer a turn 3 Cascade at a high hit rate, which doesn't mean all too much when normal Domain Rhinos can still do that just at sorcery speed. Bring to Light Scapeshift married the normal Valakut package with the Valky Tybalt package, making for a dual threat game plan that caught opponents off guard. Meanwhile, Mono Red Burn cut all the white cards from the deck for a classic red deck wins feel, which seems to have aptly achieved its name by being tied for the highest win rate at the tournament. Simic Merfolk packed green in the traditional mono blue list for sideboard cards like Pick Your Poison and Boseiju, but also had a list running Pioneer Amalia favorite Cenote Scout. The dual-colored fish produced better results than the other 2 versions of the deck in Prague with a 62.5% win rate overall. Temur Prowess dropped the Murktide, added some Underworld Breach, and packed plenty of burn spells to power itself to a quick 61.9% win rate with 4 total decks in the room. Meanwhile, the Kahira-assisted version of Azorius Control slowed the game down instead, with a similar number of decks in Prague and just a slightly smaller win rate at 61.1% overall. Azorius Hammer, distinct from its mono-white cousin thanks to cards like Spell Pierce and Cryptic Coat among other blue additions to the deck, had the most copies in the room of these top win rate decks with 5 copies of the archetype. It performed much better than the mono-colored version of the deck as well, with a 60.8% win rate compared to the 40% win rate of the single-colored deck. The top 8 archetype Scam Zoo had 2 versions of the deck that cut 8 cards from the main aggressive Domain Zoo plan for the Grief Scam package. With a 60% win rate across its 2 pilots, it's not clear that smashing Scam and Zoo together has the clear upgrade to their normal plan, but hey, it worked here, and it got it in the top 8. Naya Scapeshift splashed white into the Valakut-based combo deck and saw 3 copies of the archetype, ending with a 58.3% win rate, while an Asmo variation of the Esper Goryo's list had a similar number of decks, but a lower 56.7% win rate instead.
While none of these decks have the sample size to be clear frontrunners for top format decks, it's still interesting to note which of them had high win rates across multiple decks, as tweaks and variations on these archetypes might be the key to unlocking another strong archetype for the modern format.
Finally, we've reached the main course of the breakdown, where we're going to be looking at the top presence decks at the event and break down their head-to-head matchup against one another. While I do have the data on every single deck that was at the event, I'm only looking at the top decks as the ones you're most likely to run into online or at your LGS. Also, let's be honest, this video has gone on long enough as it is, let alone giving you the results of 93 head-to-head matches for at least 11 decks. I'm sure you're just getting tired of my voice by now.
The most played deck at the event, Domain Zoo, did extremely well against half of the other top decks in the room, while it struggled against the other half. I know a lot of people were looking at decks that could beat this archetype specifically, so look at the decks that could either play extremely fast or prey upon decks that want to put creatures on the board. Esper Goryos and Amulet Titan barely squeaked out an above 50% win rate against the deck, but Hardened Scales, Domain Rhinos, and specifically Mono Black Coffers ate the deck and its array of domain creatures for breakfast. While Leyline Scion hands were sure to be better than others, if the deck failed to give itself evasion or lost either piece of the Leyline Scion combo, these decks were able to pick it apart. On the plus side for the deck, Domain Zoo destroyed Tron, Scam, and Creativity, while having a favorable go-around against Yawgmoth and Murktide, despite Murktide splashing green specifically for Pick Your Poison, which is 1000% coming in this matchup. Yawgmoth's overall win rate was below 50%, which might be a little bit of a surprise. However, it had a losing record against 6 of the top presence decks in the room, which stands to reason why it was so low overall. Even some of its good matchups, Yawgmoth was closer to 50% than above it, save for the 62.5 win percent against the Temur Murktide decks. While this specific event was a rough one for Yawgmoth overall, it still seems to kind of have that 50-50 pilot skill matchup against a lot of the field. Well, except for Creativity, Domain Rhinos, and Hardened Scales, that is. Yawgmoth doing poorly into Rhinos isn't anything new either, so the fact that the deck still exists in larger numbers means that Yawgmoth's win rate wasn't going to skyrocket as high as everybody thought it might right after the Violent Outburst ban. Tron had it rough across the board, being eaten up by Domain Zoo, Amulet Titan, and Mono Black Coffers. Unfortunately for the deck that skips up the curve, it ran into the most Domain Zoo decks out of all of these top presence decks, besides the Domain Zoo Mirror. It did, however, still put up a fight against the other combo decks in the format. It also beat up on the Rhinos deck even more now that they had to play at mostly sorcery speed, and it turned Hardened Scales into soft scales. Yeah, that was kind of bad. Newcomer Esper Goryos had a pretty solid matchup spread against the top decks in the format, going favorable against the 2 most seen decks at Prague, Domain Zoo and Yawgmoth, while packing an extremely strong Titan, Creativity, and Domain Rhinos matchup. It also did well into Hardened Scales and Mono Black Coffers, having above 50% win rate against those decks. Where the deck faltered a bit was against the decks that could disrupt it well enough, quick enough. Rakdos Scam is always a rough matchup for decks that need a specific combination of cards to work, while Temur Murktide was surprisingly the worst head-to-head for the deck, due in part to the deck going green for Pick Your Poison, which was a 1-mana answer to basically every win con that could be revived in this deck. Surprisingly, Tron was another deck that had a winning record against the Esper Goryos deck, although it wasn't very far under 50%, so it could be closer to even than it was in Prague. The quintessential modern combo deck, Amulet Titan, played well into every single deck in the top presence that did not have a copy of Grief in the main deck, with Esper Goryos and Rakdos Scam by far being its worst matchups. It also stumbled a bit against the 5-color Creativity lists, as cards like Spell Pierce and Reprieve bought the deck enough stalling time to have a favorable win rate overall. Titan still looks to dominate the metagame though, especially if Tron decks continue to come out in larger numbers to try to beat up the remaining Rhinos decks, as that is a very good matchup for Titan. Rakdos Scam was a great choice against any of the decks that wanted to combo or have a combination of cards themselves to try to win the game with. It therefore did extremely well into the Esper Goryo's list as well as the Amulet Titan decks. Scam's winning matchup against Murktide continued over the Temur version, as the green splash doesn't really do anything for the deck against Scam. Creativity coming back to the top presence decks means Scam did pick up a slightly unfavorable matchup, and the Domain Zoo deck ended up being an issue for Scam decks as well. Turns out, it's hard to grease Scam a card that enters the battlefield on turn 0. Another thing to note is the 0% win rate Scam had against Domain Rhinos. Now, although the sample size is very small with just 4 matches played between the two deck archetypes, the older Temur Rhinos version of the deck was a much closer matchup for Scam, although slightly unfavorable. So while it could just be bad beats in Prague, it'll be something to keep our eyes on as Modern plays out more. Temur Murktide's matchups were full of high highs and low lows, as the deck only put up a 50% win rate or higher against 3 of the other top presence decks. Now, while it did put up a 63.2% win rate against Esper Goryos and a massive 73.7% win rate against Creativity, it wasn't enough to cancel out the subpar records against the remaining decks in the format. Close to a 50% win rate against Domain Zoo, Murktide couldn't hold a candle to Yawgmoth, Tron, Scam, Domain Rhinos, Hardened Scales, and especially couldn't even get close to the candle on Mono Black Coffers. At the very least, the Green Splash did what it was supposed to do against the enchantments and big flyers in Prague, but it didn't really help Murktide harder. 5-color Creativity attacked the top end of the metagame in a split fashion, with an under 50% win rate against Domain Zoo, but a 68% win rate against Yawgmoth. While it had an abysmal record against both Esper Goryos and Temur Murktide, it had a range of slightly positive to extremely good matchups against all the other top presence decks. Notably, the Domain Rhinos deck losing the ability to use Force Negation on the Creativity player's turn for free protection to their Crashing Footfalls meant that the counter magic that Creativity ran was much more devastating for the Rhinos deck to face. Speaking of our former top archetype in the format, it's still in the top presence decks even though it ate a ban. While I think it's an exaggeration to say that anyone believed the deck would actually be out of the format entirely, I do believe that Domain Rhino settled down around where everybody thought it might, if not maybe even a little lower in win rate than expected. The deck had an awful time against Tron, as is kind of expected, but also couldn't really do much against the Esper Goryos and 5-color Creativity lists. As I mentioned just before, the need for Rhinos to now play on their turn makes Force Negation lines unavailable and gives counter magic more agency against the deck. Additionally, Rhinos already suffered from decks that went over the top of it, so it's no surprise to see decks putting out giant creatures ahead of the curve, preying on it. The other matchup that we might want to keep tabs on is the Mono Black Coffers matchup. Only one match at the LMS event gives us inconclusive data to paint an accurate picture on the head-to-head, and previously, the Temur version of Rhinos was actually slightly favored against the Coffers deck. Hardened Scales mustered itself into the top presence decks with good matchups against the 2 most played decks in Prague. A 56.3% win rate against Domain Zoo and a 63.6% win rate against Yawgmoth put the deck on track to be a top performer overall. But then the rest of the decks that were at the top of the meta in the format became an issue. Tron specifically ate Scales alive, while Amulet Titan, Creativity, and Domain Rhinos also put up over 60% win rate against the modular counters deck. Closer games, although still unfavorable ones, against Esper Goryos and Rakdos Scam gave the deck a little breathing room, while it also housed Murktide and Coffers in that matchup. I'm not quite sure how Hardened Scales has the staying power to be the top presence deck in the metagame if it shakes up a little bit more and we see like less Zoo, more combo decks, but it for sure has the die-hard audience to keep propping it up even if it isn't situated the best, although right now it looks halfway decent if you're going to be playing against the top decks of Zoo and Yawgmoth. Lastly, we come to Mono Black Coffers, the highest win rate out of all of the decks in the top presence decks. The deck seems to have gotten its high win rate based on the fact that it was 50% or better against the 3 most played decks in the room, sporting an astonishing 80.8% win rate against the Domain Zoo decks. Although weaker to the Esper Goryos, Rakdos Scam, and 5-color Creativity decks, Mono Black Coffers had game against the other combo and creature decks, except Hardened Scales, where it seems to have won 0 out of the 3 matchup the archetype played head-to-head. The big mana deck might be the choice of Tron pilots looking for a similar style of deck with a better position in the metagame in the upcoming weeks, as the Carnboard style game plan feels familiar despite not having the same game-winning threats that Tron tends to run.
With our reflection of the event coming to a close, I usually like to pick out a deck that was the breakout deck of the event, which usually aligns with having a high win rate and a high metagame share. So this is kind of like your just desserts for the event. For LMS Prague, it came down to a tough decision between the Esper Goryos list and the Mono Black Coffers deck. While Coffers did have a larger win rate by only 0.9%, it also had half of the decks in the room compared to the Esper Goryos list. While looking at the other top presence decks and how these archetypes matched up head-to-head against them, I'm looking at these decks specifically: Domain Zoo, 5-color Creativity, Tron, and the Domain Rhinos matchups for these decks. I'm doing this because I'm kind of making a prediction here that Modern is going to shift a little bit more towards these combo control based decks over the current assortment of creature based decks, meaning that zoo numbers will most likely go down now that the kind of hype has died down on that, while creativity and potentially things like Amulet Titan go up in the number of decks that you will see. I do think that Tron is in a worse position than Titan or even the Mono Black Coffers list, which means that I think that these numbers will go down besides the long-standing Tron stands, and I think that people won't be as afraid to jam the Rhinos list after it did pretty well into both Domain Zoo and Yawgmoth. From my breakdown, this also shifts the favor towards Esper Goryos, so with all of this kind of extra opinionated analysis in mind, and the hype behind it from the online testing crowd, I'm calling Esper Goryos the breakout deck for Prague. So, what did you think about Modern? Do you think that Violent Outburst ban shook up the format enough to dive back into, or are you looking at something else to leave before you wind up coming back to the format? What decks from LMS Prague are you most excited to play or watch, and what do you think is the current best deck in Modern? I obviously think it's Esper Goryos, but it's up for debate. Let me know down in the comments below, and make sure to thumbs up the video if you've liked it, as that helps me out a ton. And again, if you've watched this whole entire breakdown, thank you so much for sticking with me. And if you skipped ahead, honestly, let me know what part you were looking for so I can streamline these videos in the future. As always, make sure to tap that subscribe button to stay updated on when I release more deck techs, metagame analysis, and in general, Magic content. See you later.